amongst all of our freelance artists, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about later on as well. Like those conversations need to hit a critical mass before I think we can really embrace the kind of change that a lot of us are looking for.
Well, that's great. I think it's important to think about the types of institutions that gain access to, say, regional theaters. I think many students feel like they don't have, so I went to, Jimmy John's University. I didn't go to Yale. I didn't go to NYU. So I'm not going to have a pathway to be legible with in these mainstream institutions. So is that something that resonates for the rest of the panel, the idea of thinking about structural pathways that can open up access?
Yeah, I was just, when you were talking, Eric, we started a program a couple of years ago with Brooklyn College that's somewhat similar. That's a post-grad program, actually. So it's something not as an internship, and we eliminated all unpaid internships, which I also think was a big step for us in terms of reducing a barrier to entry for just the theater in general. Not, I think we still have a ways to go to actually pay people a livable wage in our various cities, but we have a Brooklyn College program that does something similar, where we're bringing in post-grads and embedding them in multiple different areas within the theater and introducing them to our community. And they no doubt become indispensable within a very short amount of time and are able to stay on as staff members at this sort of, lost period where you move to a new city and have to figure out how to start, obviously Brooklyn is not a new city in the public, but it is figuring out what are those entry points? How do you get an introduction in a place that feels so closed off, has been really amazing. And then I would say, yeah, in terms of gatekeeping, getting rid of our unpaid internships has also been a start, although I think there's, other problems that arise in terms of figuring out then what is our entry level. How do we continue to bring in folks and not just lose those positions entirely? What does learning look like if your internships are paid and then they feel like you can only afford a couple instead of hundreds? So I think that there's still work to do there in terms of figuring out what are those levers of embedding learning at every level within an organization. And making sure that's a value of our organizations, that doesn't feel like you have to come knowing every piece of how to work within the American theater.
I mean, one of the things that gets me, so I didn't go to grad school for this, and one of the things that is just so difficult to see is the amount of theaters, other places, higher education that basically say, get an MA, get an MFA, and then you'll be able to get a job afterwards. And that is just not true. It's just not true. And so when I look at that, I think to myself, I actually really want to disrupt that. And I really also, I want to be in a place where folks can actually gather experience within the theaters, similar to what everybody's talking about here. And actually have jobs doing it, right? So to me, it's not like my first job wasn't a massive learning opportunity. Like I learned at every single step of the way. I messed up at every single step, and so that's what first jobs are for. You know what I mean? And I found mentorship in that, and luckily, and ultimately, it was actually through those people that I felt like I belonged in some way, right? Because they told me that I could do it even if I had messed up. And so the things that I'm interested in disrupting is sort of like, how many degrees do you need? How much, sort of specialized education do you need to actually work in a theater? And so part of that is also about eliminating education requirements for a bunch of the positions that we have. Like, I'm not sure that we folks need to have a certain level of education to come in and work in our shop. I don't know why we need to even have that as a barrier. And so thinking about those things in terms of what are the things that we're looking for, and how are we at Woolley making it so that it's as broad a swath of people that can have access to these things, and that you don't have to sort of like climb the education ladder to be able to get to work in a theater like Woolley.
I'm so glad you said that because and we at Casey Melting Pot have an apprentice model that kind of echoes back to that, because we bring community members in who want to learn to be stage managers or directors, and they work with us. And I think more of that and making that transparent is really important, because you're right. I mean, you don't need a degree to be a great actor. I mean, sorry, guys. I mean, you don't. You can learn by doing. And so I think saying that out loud is liberating, not only for the students, but to kind of demystify some of that.
It's not to say if you want to do it, go do that. You know what I mean? Like, great. You know, there should be all of those things, right, happening. Folks who do get degrees and want to actually get deeper into their studies versus folks who are just like, let me go out there and do it. The issue that I'm seeing is, you know, literally for entry-level jobs, people have master's degrees, 2 master's degrees, you know, PhDs, etc. And that's what's like, wait, what?
Snehal, have you all done, I know you all have had apprentice models for a while, at least as I remember from my grad school days of East-West engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing we often don't talk about in theater that's tied to this is class. So that, you know, for me or at East West Players, I feel like socioeconomic barriers are the biggest barriers to access in our field. And so what are ways we can disrupt or challenge those? I think, you know, everyone kind of alluded to what that is, right? But and how we can do that. And someone just put in the chat about student loan debt, because yes, you should not be graduating with $90,000 in debt and then be applying for a $35,000 job, right? Or more. And so I think those are big barriers. I think our university programs are still, you know, I view universities as preservers of colonialism and colonial models, and they're still such hierarchical models of operation. And, you know, I'm a graduate of both an undergraduate and an MFA theater degree, and they prepared me for a regional theater world that isn't the world of theater today. The programs just did not update to the times. And I think that's fine. What I don't advocate for is learning based on what I don't want to do, right? Which is one way to exit these programs. But I think the other thing that, which Maria was talking about a little bit, is that the university programs are not prepared for non-traditional candidates. So at East West Players or in the Asian American community and many communities of colors, you know, your parents don't want you to be an actor. They want you to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. And you may, you know, people may go that route, but they still have that calling, or a little bit later stage in their life, they decide to go back into theater or playwriting. And, you know, there aren't many outlets for them to kind of find themselves as an artist or to get that training. I think for us, we've shifted a lot of our conservatory training programs to be for those non-traditional candidates. Because the other thing that is, you know, I also think wanting and having a family should not be a barrier to access in this field, and it somehow is, right? It's, you know, family is viewed as an obstacle, having kids is, and so I think what are models that allow folks to still have a life, to have a family, and to still pursue a career in this field, are things that we are really, really looking at. I think at East West Players, you know, and moving forward. But I think those are some things that the university world just embeds certain ways that this is how the field is, or this is the way you should be. And it doesn't need to be that way, and it can change, right? All we have to do is say that we don't want it to be that way.
Well, this is great. I'm going to stitch kind of some of the responses to this question, and thank you so much. The chat is blowing up of saying thank you all for articulating these points, and particularly when we're talking about unsettling this notion of family and childcare or elder care, or, you know, of the rehearsal schedules limit that, the expectation of the unions, again, another structural barrier that hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about, that, you know, you have expectation of how many hours it takes to rehearse a show, right? So if I can do my show in, you know, 3 hours of rehearsal versus 6, I mean, so be it. So I think, you know, pressing up against some of these expectations, to just taking away some of the keywords that I heard here. You know, we're talking about degree barriers, we're talking about class barriers, we're talking about these kind of hierarchical, you know, archives of, you know, colonial structures that limit the possibility of us being and becoming differently together, or even the types of theater that we can imagine making are limited by the kind of the structural inequities embedded in the training systems, or even the concept of producing and making theater in the same way. So that's really cool things for us to continue to string forward. This notion of disruption and how we think about our approach to systemic dismantling or structural dismantling, we're going to have to think outside of the box that we're in. And sometimes those systems just are on loop, right? Like, this is how you train an actor, this is how you train a director, and when they're done, they go here and they do this. Well, I mean, sometimes a lot of times it just doesn't work that way. And so some of the class dynamics, I think, are embedded. All of this would segue us to think about the next question. And again, these are fluid. This isn't a linear conversation. We can circle back at any moment. But I'm thinking about economic parity, because schools cost money, whether they're community colleges, whether I'm taking a master class online, whether I'm, you know, learning how to edit something, or I'm learning how to take a lighting class. However, there is a cost associated with it. So what type of economic parity initiatives might we be thinking about that can help us change these structural inequities? And so I'm thinking about not only funding equities for the theaters themselves, and particularly global majority, you know, serving theaters, or PWI, predominantly white institutions and theaters that want to help be a part of economic parity initiatives. What does the money look like? Because no matter what we're doing, it takes money to do it. It takes money to go to school, it takes money to train, or it takes money for transportation to get to woolly mammoth, to get to this, you know, free opportunity that might be there. So what can we do to drill down into some of the economic support for this?
I mean, one thing I would say that has been a real exciting piece of what, you know, I hate to put it in that frame, but of silver lining of COVID is all of the collaborations that have happened. And I think understanding, one, how much we need our local community, how much we have to make a case to our local community about our own need, their need of us, you know, really articulating that both ways. And then I think we've all, you know, being able to say to our theaters of the cervical majority, like, what do you need? How can we help provide it? What does partnership look like? In a way that I think a lot of predominantly institutions were perhaps not interested in that conversation, thought they had it under control, that they did feel it in those communities. And this moment really made it clear that you are not, in fact, in the conversation you think you're in, not in partnership in a way that feels equitable. And so being able to really open those doors in a new way in both directions, and expand generosity of learning from one another and figure out how we do this together, and offer it as understanding these theaters have so much to offer our audiences and vice versa, and we want their audiences in our theaters and vice versa, and we have funding that is, you know, that can be actually just passed through or put to use by other theaters in a way that evens the scales and makes it clear that we're here, but we're also here to be collaborators and partners, because we were all actually supposed to be serving our cities together with these stories. And the only other point I wanted to make earlier is that I think we also have the opportunity I just think we work in the arts also. So I think we approach these conversations as if we are sometimes making cars. but we are deeply of humans. We are responsible for telling these stories. So I think really digging into our process, starting with the work that we're creating and thinking about what work has to teach us, how that necessarily and humans making it, how those humans are parents. What does that mean? What does it tell us about how we need to structure this actual show? I think is just to all of Snehal's points, I think, just speaking about like, how do we serve humans? And then be able to tell those stories, I think is really a great starting point, and something that we have plenty of other industries would, are looking to us to actually provide.
That's great. That's a good question to keep, steady for us. Who are we serving? And again, when you said we're all supposed to be serving the communities in our city. And I love that provocation, because it's absolutely not true in a lot of cities. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. Anyone else have things to say about economics?
I mean, I have so many things to say about the economics. So we're a capitalist society, right? Naming it. And someone said to me recently, they were saying, you're anti-racist, right? You're anti-patriarchy and also anti-capitalist. And I said, I don't think Wooly is anti-capitalist, unfortunately. I don't think there's any way that Wooly could survive being anti-capitalist. We can be subversive and transgressive amongst those systems, but that's the system of, that this theater company was set up with, IRS, all this kind of stuff, right? The rich just got richer, literally. We all know this over the Trump administration into now. And the conversation around what folks are doing with that money, look at what Mackenzie Scott is doing and other folks are doing with that money, that is literally coming from the capitalist system. It is literally coming from there. So this question about sort of the funding and how we actually think about the funding, particularly for institutions that are historically white, predominantly white, I sometimes get a little bit frustrated with the fact that or this is just me, I'm trying to dream up what is the alternative or what we are moving towards from being a predominantly white institution. And Woolly Mammoth is not going to be a theater that is going to be specific to an ethnic group, or culturally specific. It is not going to be Woolly Mammoth. So are we staying a predominantly white theater and embracing that in some way, or where are we moving towards? And to me, this is tied to the capitalism conversation. Folks, people are starting to change the narrative. The culture is shifting in ways, and frankly, those with the most privilege are starting to actually have the conversations that haven't been had. I've mentioned Mackenzie Scott, and I'm not saying that she's the second coming, by no means, but the point of the matter is the fact that East West Players just got a massive grant from someone without even meeting them probably to begin with, or hearing of them, is a huge deal. So it's a little bit connected to what Shanta is saying is, I used to think of it as Robin Hooding from the larger organizations, but I also really want to have the conversation about where the PWIs, what is the North Star, right? Because ultimately, Woolly Mammoth is not going to be a theater of color. It is not going to be of by and for Black people, of by and for, AAPI. That's not actually what we've been meant to do. And so where are we moving towards in terms of liberation, justice, and our community? And how can we actually have an interdependent community where our success is actually tied with our community's success? It's really hard to do in that system, in the capitalist system.
Well, I appreciate the honesty. I think, there's this idea of, there's an infantilizing nature to the philanthropic underpinnings of theater funding, right? So it's this idea that theaters of color or theater, I use the term global majority, serving theaters, like we can't handle our money, we don't know what to do, so we like really need help figuring it out. And the disproportionate amount of funding for global majority theaters vis-a-vis predominantly white theaters is extraordinary. So a budget, you know, if you gave you know, a theater that is serving global majority audiences, you know, a fraction of their peer institutions funding that they're getting, there could be some change that would be affected. So I'm wondering, from some of the keywords that I'm hearing here about, you know, can you be a capitalist centered, you know, economic structure as part of your theater and be anti-racist? Are those things antithetical, or is there a way to kind of re-envision your relationship to your funders that might open up opportunities for partnership? This is what Shanta was talking about, and different ways of helping different populations that are serving global majority theaters to say, what do you need, right? How can we help you? Maybe Woolly Mammoth can't become a, you know, global majority theater serving institution, but would it advocate for East-West players? Would it advocate for a KC Melting Pot, or you know, an ensemble theater or something like that, you know, which is obviously one of the bigger theaters that are serving African-American audiences in the nation, but nonetheless still in financial deficit in comparison to larger theaters. Anyone else want to weigh in on the economic structures? Are we, well, East-West, you got mentioned of having a magical unicorn donor. So, and there are limitations.
Yeah, I'll touch on some other things and we'll come back to that. You know, what I like to call the original sin right now in our industry is the 501c3 model, right? Because that's a certain model of like, how do we have it that people who have never worked a day in their life in theater are the ones who are choosing the leadership, right? Who are passing the budget, right? Why? No other field does that. I'm not going to go be on a medical board, you know, or a bank board if I've never worked at those institutions, but yet I can be on a theater board and chair it and have huge influence. So I think that model, first of all, has to be looked at, right? And unfortunately, you know, you have to live within that model, but what are ways to break it down? What are ways to make it less of a hierarchy, to flatten it? What are ways to really shift it has to happen. And I think universities are also structured in a similar way. And I think those things have to be torn down for us to move forward. The other thing is, you should teach economics in training programs. We just, again, do not talk about money. So in 7 years of training in theater, I left with knowing how to create a budget for a show, but not my life. I didn't know how much a director made, right? I didn't know about, like, you know, and you have to be creative to make a living in this profession, right? Especially right out of school. But we don't ever talk or train or teach or give those opportunities, or they're rare or they're very optional. But I think they should be a part of the central conversation. I also think self-producing, you know, programs should teach about self-producing work. I think they get focused on some of the headier aspects, but I think the artists need to understand, you know, boots on the ground, how much it costs to run a show, what it is, because they will also understand then the decisions that all of us have to make when we're faced with planning a season. The other thing that I hope gets disrupted is that university students, graduate students are free labor for partner regional theaters, right? Because yes, you're gaining experience, but you're not being viewed as an artistic equal or a colleague to those folks who are coming into your institution. And so I think that is something that a lot of us have experienced, and I think there could have been opportunity there that wasn't. And it continues to be one of those things where you're paying to have an education, and what you're paying is to be an usher or to be a part of the strike crew for something. And it's great for you to get experience on every aspect, right? And to know what everyone does, for sure. But I think what are ways that we cannot be just free labor in the system? Our students are viewed that way for the regional theaters or for visiting artists as well. the thing about these large gifts and things that are coming in for culturally specific institutions is we have been under-resourced for so long that this is just helping us get to where we should be remotely, right? It's helping us get to parity and equity. And honestly, up until this year, I kind of every 2 weeks was worried about payroll, right? For 4.5 years, 5 years, I have always been worried about payroll. And now I realize there is a model where I don't have to worry about that I can plan ahead, strategically look forward, which is a luxury that I would say culturally specific institutions just have not had. And now we can maximize our reach. And we've been doing the work, we will do the work whether the money is not there. We know who our communities are and the audiences we serve. But these funds now help us kind of be where, be at the level we should be. And I think, yes, the disruption of money, the funders are like, well, institutions that we give this much money to aren't going to know what to do with it. We'll figure out ways to do with it. We know what to do with it. That's not an issue.
Yep. But also, Snehal, I mean, you name that as this special magical thing, but we just had the SVOG. So I think when you look at the numbers that some of these larger predominantly white institutions received as a result of that, it's it's not really balanced. It's there's no correction happening here, right? It's sort of it's just the strange condition that we find ourselves in. I want to say, David, I see your comment. And I'm just going to say, listen, I hope you're hearing that we're not just criticizing, because I started this off, I'm afraid. So we're not just criticizing higher education, we're criticizing the entire industry. And I think what I just want to say is I think it's really important, I think, that we, in any space that we have the opportunity to be as candid as we can and as critical as we can in service of accountability and in service of really just trying to understand what needs to be fixed, as opposed to, because I think every one of us has been in a space where our job has been to sing the praises of our organization, to talk about our successes, to talk about how we are change agents, to talk about the transformation that we are leading. But that actually paints a false picture of the actual industry that we are all kind of perpetuating and part of. So we have to be able to be candid about what we are seeing happening in the world with each other and with ourselves. So Couch Shakes, we launched back in January, and this is happening now in a really interesting way. So this is the thing that we're watching, right? Because like all of these institutions of higher learning are basically sending out artists who for the first number of years of their lives are entering a freelance industry. Right. And the freelance industry is I've been in rehearsal now for about a week and a half in person at my theater. We've set up a little stage in our upper grove. So it's outdoors. It's an outdoor rehearsal process. It's really beautiful. But I was asking the other day, we were chatting with the actors, because everyone who's coming back into this industry right now is coming back with some extraordinary amount of PTSD, right? There's an extraordinary amount of trauma that all of us have experienced. And then when we focus in on this industry, the idea that so many of our theaters basically just canceled our seasons and shut our artists off from the community that they had spent so much of their time and livelihood developing and sacrificing for. And I asked them sort of what they needed. And one actor said to me, I need to believe that the show that I'm doing right now is not the last show that I will ever do, because every show that I do feels that way.
Oh, this is beautiful.
And so we back in January launched the thing. We call it our artist circle, but it's essentially it's a program modeled after guaranteed income, which is our idea was listen, let's identify 5 individual artists whose work inspires us. And then what we're going to offer them is guaranteed income of, our Couch Shakes it's a nominal number, but it's $500 a month for a year. And to each of these 5 individuals. And it's basically what's the difference between guaranteed income and a grant of some sort is that there's no deliverables, there's no strings attached. It's literally just there to support their livelihood, their living. They receive the checks. We create opportunities for them to come and engage with our organization, but there's no expectation, there's only invitation. And it's part of a larger kind of program that we're doing, which is our what we're calling our Shared Light initiative, which is a way of rethinking resources. So this is about like getting down into the kind of very sort of building blocks of these systems that we're operating in and saying like, no, listen, so many of our theaters, what we do is we hoard our resources, right? So we have like our development directors, and then those development directors, some often have like an assistant and an associate director. And then those associate directors at some institutions, like these departments are really large, and their whole kind of purpose for being is to create a cohort of supporters and then to hoard that cohort. And so one of the questions that we're asking is how do we just flip that, right? Like how do we get out of this hoarding mentality and really getting into a space of shared mentality? And then what does shared mean, right? What does it actually mean to genuinely share, and not with ulterior motive, not with agenda, right? Not with a kind of centering of self, but actually a decentering of self, and to be thinking about like what that means to just spread this out and to share the resources that we have in a way that is about abundance, right? Which is really just about abundance. And our question with this Artist Circle program is simply, of every theater in the Bay Area, right, committed to some kind of guaranteed income for 2 to 3 artists, and there's like 300 theaters in the Bay Area, right? So like some of them are very, very small and would never be able to do this, but some of them are very, very large. And so the idea would be to get right down the middle of that, right? But if there's like 300 theaters and we hit on average 2 actors, two actors, and like we can talk and we can expand that to include designers, any kind of freelance artist, arts worker, right? And we commit to that. What you've got right there is you've got 600 arts workers, right? Being supported in a way that is just about like, listen, this is like, okay, your paycheck pays for your rent. This $500 a month is going to help support your utilities, your childcare, your whatever, right? And to me, it's like sort of like, so we can talk about the funder structures and all this other stuff. And I love this. This is a great conversation. So I'm saying yes and to everything that's been said here, but also I think like, can we begin to rethink how we budget? So this is the last thing I'll say is like for Cal Shakes, like we see our budget as a moral document. Like that's a phrase that we use frequently, right? Your budget is a moral document. You should be able to look at the budget and you should be able to know exactly where your values as an institution lie.
Well, this is so important, absolutely important. And I'm going to kind of stitch this together, and we'll continue to add yes and to the next part of the discussion. But the takeaways here are, responding to some of the kind of, hey, can we just talk about like positive things about academia? But you're saying it's a false contract that we're making with our students to prepare them to not be culturally literate, fluent in my aspiration, citizens of the community, of the artistic community at large. And there is a disproportionate amount of suffering for artists of the global majority, specifically because of who they are. And we also had questions in here talking about, let's think about diversity and make sure that we're talking about neurodiversity and ability, and how are we troubling this kind of ableism that is, also intrinsic to some of these systems. So, we'll continue to add that. But economic wise, we have to think creatively. We have artists that are in our institutions that are food insecure. We have kids that can't be in a show because they don't have enough money to pay their rent and they're working 3 jobs. So those are students that are quote unquote invisible or not quote unquote participating, but they can't participate. They can't go to rehearsal for 5 hours a night when that's the only time that they can do their other job. So these are real, dilemmas. So the idea of doing this kind of micro-lending vibe out of a theater institution is revolutionary, of thinking about how we might look at line items, not just to make the theater, but also to sustain the artist. So how might that trickle down into the academy? How might we think about ways to create micro-lending pools for, utilities for students, food insecurity? You have students that are suffering right in your midst, but they remain invisible. So thinking about, Donatella just threw in wonderful mutual aid. And what does that look like structurally at the institutional level, not just at the department level, but at the provost level of understanding that. So these are wonderful ways to kind of think through this economic question. And we invite you to continue this conversation throughout the conference and the rest of the plenaries that are forthcoming. So I'm going to segue then to think about, we've now talked about some of the kind of larger structural barriers. We've talked about some of the economic ones that are not just inside the institution, but also have great mirrors within the academic environment. What do we think about creative intervention? Because, all of these affect what we're seeing on stage, right? So if you think about our early discussion about the degree barriers, well, certain degrees get you access to certain theaters. Or if you talk about representation, well, certain students who have access to those institutions are the ones who get access to those theaters. Economic barriers, the same. So what type of creative intervention, how might we look at some of that crowdsourcing or alternative ruptures we're talking about, and think about how do we get different types of artists and directors and designers, that, like, what does that look like to really disrupt what we're seeing on stage? So do we always have to see the same type of playwright or the same type of work, the same type of design, et cetera?
I want to jump in here because I'm in the process of this exact experiment with some other theaters. It's Woolly Mammoth, Baltimore Center Stage, the Rep of St. Louis, and Long Wharf. We're putting together an artistic caucus. So one of the things that we were talking about was our literary departments, our new work departments. Everybody just reads the same play most of the time. And frankly, a lot of the time, because we're not in New York, not actually hearing about certain other plays that are being held by agents, et cetera, whatever, and only given to certain theaters. But then also, it's all the same. It feels like often all the same people and all the same people who are coming out of grad programs, et cetera. Not to say that any of that is bad, but it's again, it's just not, tends to be homogenous population in terms of, doing the kind of masters, et cetera, whatever, to get into playwriting, to get the agent, to get the thing. So what we're trying to do is we are actually bringing artists, folks, anybody could apply to this, and we're paying them over the course of the year to help scout for all 4 theaters. And so the idea is this is talk about disrupting the creative process and the new work department model. This is about not us getting a ton of plays from agents and then reading those plays and deciding. This is about actually having some artists from all over the country source, talk, evangelize about folks that they are really excited about and already in conversation with or want to be in conversation with. And we're really working to make it as intergenerational, like just an amazing group of people who would have never been the group of people that, I would pick up the phone and say, who are the artists who you've been talking to recently? Who are the people who you're hanging out with in the, in the storefront scene in Chicago, for example, or wherever. So we're actually in the middle. We're in the middle of actually of doing the final interviews for these folks. It's a pilot for the next year, and we're really hoping to disrupt this kind of assembly line that happens in terms of particularly playwrights. But we're sourcing and scouting all artists, right? It's choreographers, actors, designers, etc. That all 4 theaters should get to know. And we can do that because we don't feel like we're in competition with each other. This is what Eric was talking about before, about abundance. We can do that because we don't feel like we have to hoard. Oh my gosh, we found a writer that is amazing. I'm going to basically say we're going to do all their work and you're not going to do it. We feel like if we do, all 4 of us find an artist that we all want to work on, then we'll work on it together. Great. So yeah, that's one of the ways that we're trying some creative disruption there.
This is great. And the chat is responding. And, if you've ever done these Zoom moderation, there's like 4 different boxes you have to look in. So bear with me. But yeah, I think this is a great model to consider. Many times agents and managers are, their job is to gatekeep, and their job is to place their artist, and they're in collaborations with particular theaters to do that work. So I think the repetition of the same sound bites of, oh, have you read so and so, and then everybody repeats the same playwright, I think that there is a performance to that we have to disrupt to some degree, and not feel that somehow mentioning someone who's not on the radar is somehow not acceptable. So I love that.
Also think artists, apologies for my internet stinks, but in case going through the I think the idea of artists as curators is a really strong place to start too. And this idea of multidisciplinary work, I think from academia on, I don't know a single artist who considers themselves one thing at this point. There's not a playwright who doesn't also think of themselves as a producer, as a violinist. And so this world in which we all have to wear multiple hats, I think we should be acknowledging that in the way that we teach, in the way that we put artists together, and in the way that we listen to artists who are generally in much more diverse communities of creators, and bring those voices into the center of our curation process. Because I think it's just the work that's happening is so rarely happening. And I wrote a script. Now figure out how to produce it. It comes in so many different forms, and I think we need to be looking in different spaces for it.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm sorry about the mic going left there. Yeah, we're hearing a lot. People are very interested. We're hearing questions about, people want to know, Maria, about the rubric for the caucus that's inspiring folks, thinking about artistic curation, getting the artist as curator, community as curator, because people know things, and not asking that kind of circles back to earlier discussions of who are we serving, how are we using the theater to actually serve the needs of the community, and are we actually listening, and thinking about how we can be better at this. Some of the things I'm going to segue. I can't read the chat. It becomes really wonderful, but I can only add value from it as much. But I do want you to know that I am looking. But, as we continue, feel free to pick up any of the questions that we've presented thus far. And we're moving into the home stretch here. So, I would like to segue. We talked about new voices. We've talked about economics. I'm really interested now to maybe move to this question of cultural literacy, because I think there are a lot of irresponsible ways that theaters are producing playwrights of the global majority to show that they're being representative, and that's, in kind of scare quotes, but also are not taking the full responsibility of making sure that the production team and the directors have the cultural fluency to actually be able to realize that work and responsibility to the community. And I don't hear us talking very much about that. It's like, we found the play, now let's just attach a director or designer, it's fine. But there are some real cultural nuances that are lost often in translation. And so I'm wondering if you all can think about what your theater is doing to not only, think about these types of questions of structural change, but how are we thinking about like ethical ecologies that are actually serving the needs of the community, and not just in an aesthetic way, not just to show, hey, we've got a new, Black playwright that we're putting on that no one knows, but is that enough? Or are we actually serving the community by asking, is this somebody that someone wants to listen to? Do you have a culturally competent director and team to realize it? Are those conversations you all are having? This happens in academia. Like, we're training folks to make theater, and to echo someone in the chat, we're training actors and designers and technicians to know theater creates community and it can foster. But are we training them to know that they're also responsible to actually have some cultural literacy about the communities that they're engaging?
I have an answer, but I'm not an answer. It's an answer and not an answer. Only because like I feel like this is like, it kind of goes back to how we started this conversation, right? Which is there are deep systemic things that have to be addressed before we have any hope of addressing like the vast majority of the questions that we're talking about today, right? Don't come about because a theater introduces a new policy or even 4 theaters introduce a new practice, right? That doesn't change the environment. It doesn't change the landscape. And kind of part of what you're describing is built upon a kind of, to lean into this notion of the capitalist model that we're all operating on, right? It's based on this notion that story and experience is a commodity to be marketed and sold. And as long as that's kind of part of the equation, whether consciously or subconsciously, as producers, we're often going to find ourselves in a situation where we're not fully understanding actually what we're trying to do. And I can't tell you how many conversations. I mean, I run a Shakespeare theater, right? So to be clear, like, there's like there's a very clear centering right there of a white man, in the middle of our name. And so what I was going to say to your question is actually a little bit of a story, but just to understand, like I've been running Cal Shakes now for 5 years. And if you were to go back and look at my tenure at Cal Shakes and you were to have like a list of like, what are the things that you do to make your organization more diverse or more inclusive or more, there's like, and you made that into a checklist, we would have checked off a whole lot of those boxes and we would have added a few additional items to it. Right. But at the end of the day, when COVID landed, we had a chance to really kind of slow down for a moment. I appreciate all the conversation about time here on the side and urgency. But the COVID actually gave a lot of us an opportunity to slow down and to actually take a really hard look at what we were doing. And one thing that we realized at Cal Shakes was that for all of that effort, the diversity of our audiences largely were unchanged. Like we grew it, but we grew at just a few percentage points, and certainly nothing even remotely approaching what many of us were aspiring towards. And the truth of it is that most of our predominantly white institutions produce works by people of color, but see that as a kind of like, that's it. It's like white artists and then people of color. And people of color sort of like, if they do 1 play a season or 2 plays a season, that's it for them, right? And so then what ends up happening is like that 1 play is your point of contact for that community. And then there is no more point of contact for another year, for another 2 years, for another 5 years. And so like, why should we expect that to have a meaningful impact? So from our perspective, this is for me, the revelation of this last year personally has been this notion that any one institution can be everything for everyone is a lie. It's like a falsehood. It's an illusion that we are creating for ourselves in order to hoard resources, right? We're like, oh no, we need the money because the money is leading us towards this. And so we're going to say that we are doing this work. And because we're doing this work, we deserve that money too. And that money goes to us and it actually bypasses those theaters of color. And so instead, what we're trying to say is like, no, let's rethink that, right? Like if we actually want to support artists of color and we want to support communities of color and their narratives, we should actually seek out the organizations that have actually been building decades-long relationships with those communities and go to them and say, how can we support you? Because you're our way in.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, we so appreciate it because, hi, we're here. We've been doing the work. We kind of got it figured out. And those are the obvious things. That goes back to Shanta saying, like, where are the partnerships? Who can we actually, if you want to bring 300 Black people to a show, I can get them to your show. But you could just partner with my theater and we could build a bigger show because they're going to be there. I mean, but for some of us who would do, work that is for global majority audiences, they only come to our shows. They don't go to any other shows. They're uniquely coming to the theater that is putting up work that speaks directly to them. And so it's a missed opportunity to not come to East-West Players or to come to Casey Melting Pot when you're trying to build community with a particular demographic, because they're our house. They're always our house. So I really appreciate you saying that. Anyone else to want to talk to this particular question? I think there's just so many ways we could go with this.
I don't want to follow Eric's mic drop, but I think everything he said. I think there's a couple of different things. One, in terms of the sharing of resources, I think the question to ask yourself is, are you only reaching out to a community or specific artists when you think of that work, right? Are you only reaching out to East-West Players when you're programming an Asian American play, right? Each and every time, because most times that happens. You can also reach out to us with other work, right? We can also work on Shakespeare or other things like that, but we only get called in a certain time. And I also think these are larger questions of what the canon is, right? What is deemed classics? Those are all things that constantly still need to, we're so attached to linear ways of storytelling, right? Where most of the world, it's outside of the US, circular storytelling, there's more innovation in those things, but we still hold on to that. The biggest issue I still have with university programs is programming work that if you don't have the resources to do properly, you should not do. So what that means is if you want to do a play with 4 South Asian characters, you should budget, and you hope that they're all students, you should still budget for 3 of them to say be professional actors in case you can't get enough students. What you shouldn't do is cast 3 students who are South Asian and then be like, oh, we couldn't find anyone, we don't have any money, so we'll put a white actor in that role. Right? So what I have experienced is there is a double standard, particularly for the Latino and Asian American community, of things that you will do, in terms of plugging in white folks for those actors or characters or roles that you wouldn't do if it was, say, a Black play. And so I think that is something that university programs continue to be dismissive of in terms of their standards. I think when they program work by Black playwrights, they tend to be vigilant about hiring a Black director, making sure that the cast is that way. But if it's any other culture or ethnicity, they are not as careful, or they're not as strict and rigorous. And then I think if you can't do it, it's the same for theaters, that I tell the same thing for theaters. But if you don't have those resources, then just don't do the work. Push it, do it a little bit later. It's also going to need a different timeline if you've never produced or connected with that community before. The other, I think the other thing is, don't beg poverty. I think university programs coming to begging poverty when we still are in this place where, size does not equate with quality, right? Size of space, of institution, but yet we still have university programs coming asking for resource sharing where they still have access to more things. And it doesn't mean you have to come to the table with money. You can offer rehearsal space. You can offer us other things, but come to the table with something if you want a partnership, and give it long timelines. And the only other thing, going back a couple of points, is that we also are funders, right? So all of our theaters are fund artists, right? And like what's happening on the larger model in terms of funding, where they're taking away hoops and restrictions, I hope we can do that also as we fund artists, right? So that we can hopefully give money that's generative towards projects, but without the same number of hoops that they have to jump through. So that trusting the artist to utilize those funds to create work, I think is still something that is still not seeing field-wide.
I want to make a pitch for something. So just to jump on what Snehal you were talking about in terms of university programs. So one of the things that I see happening, and I'm going to drop the information in the chat, there is a group of BIPOC artists who are starting a school and actually centering, different methods, different and culturally specific ones in the training. And I would look, they are doing it all on their own. There is no reason that that an exciting university partnership, like they could actually be part of an organization and actually they're already doing some fundraising and stuff. And so it's only about actually giving them more of a platform within another theater, another organization. I just keep telling them, like, let's see, maybe you can go here, maybe you can go there. But I think that there is ultimately a kind of fragility in sort of other folks sort of saying, well, wait a minute, we're not actually into that particular curriculum. We're going to create our own curriculum, and it's going to come from people of the global majority. Like, this is an amazing group of people who are basically taking matters into their own hands. And I can't tell you how many folks I've heard sort of talk about how to create master's programs at HBCUs and are thinking about how to actually, for theater training, MFAs, specifically for theater training at HBCUs. So I really hope that will happen. And I do think that, they're worth supporting.
All right, I think we're getting close to time, but that is just such a gem to think about because, we're seeing this flood of new materials that are actually doing this work of whether it be, new ways to approach actor training, new ways to kind of think about how to have, designers to be more culturally aware and engaged, having different type of critical fluency. So this is really great information. I think we have time, and Amy, please let me know in the chat of where we are. I think I would love to give some parting gifts. This has been like really just gems for the whole audience, I'm sure. But if you want to just give, kind of a top 2 things that you would hope that some of our theater departments that are here and witnessing this, what are some top 2 things, if you could say to, theater educators right now that are committed to doing this work? They're committed to building communities, to creating culturally fluent thespians and technicians and theorists. What would you ask them to say prepare as a 21st century artist at this point is absolutely necessary for them to have in their training? And we'll just go around roll call, and then I'm going to just close out and say thank you all for coming.
Are you roll calling?
Yeah, just top 2. I'll start with Maria.
Oh man,
you can pass the mic.
No, I will say, so top 2 things. I wouldn't be able to I wouldn't be in the theater if not for the community of people, and including some folks who are on this panel, being a kind of not just accountability, but guiding force, like, emotional cheerleading, all of that kind of stuff. So I would say it's like, who are those people? Find them and like hold on to them, like be magnets to each other, because it's not easy to do this kind of work and also dismantle the stuff that we need to dismantle and work on together. And then the last thing that I would say is, I firmly believe in multidisciplinary artists and in actually not categorizing yourself. I was very much in a place where everybody was like, you have to pick, are you a director, are you an actor, are you this, are you that? And I look at folks like Issa Rae and how amazing what she's been doing, and other folks like who are, I just read that like Megan Thee Stallion wants to create an elderly care community to take care of grandparents. She's getting her degree in health administration, right? So if anybody says you need to categorize yourself, that should be like a red flag for you and be like, that's not actually that useful piece of information. Do not actually put boundaries. Let your imagination go in terms of what it is that you're able to do and capable of.
Great, awesome, thank you. Shanta. Can Shanta hear me?
Oh, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's so great. Yeah, I would say, I would double down on what Maria said, as always. And, like I definitely would not still be in the theater if it weren't for Maria. I basically raised my child with Eric. And so we are one happy family who can really hold each other up. And I would say for folks working in academics and in, theater schools in general, like, tell your students that as they're becoming designers, working actors, and traveling across the country as they try to pull together their living, to bring their values with them. Don't be afraid. Don't leave them at the door and feel like you have to adapt to whatever values the theater you're stepping into holds. You can ask, and you can demand what it will take for you to be comfortable and thrive, because they need you. And I think the more we can share what it means to be a working artist, what it means to carry what you know about working in all of these places to the next place you go, is ultimately incredibly valuable, and will start these conversations or reignite these conversations, because we need to be understanding what happens at our other theaters that are best practices, and nobody knows that better than the artists that are traveling across all of our theaters. So I would just say, don't leave your values in your hotel room. Bring them into all of the spaces and let us know what's happening in the best places you've worked.
Thank you so much. We're down to 1 minute. So let's see, Eric, and then you'll take us home. Snehal.
Yeah, just really quickly, I would say, I'm seeing a question from Ali Reza about like educators and like degrees of removal from like what is the practice in the industry. And what I would say in general is actually the hardest thing right now as instructors and as leaders is actually to be able to step aside for this next generation of artists, because I believe we are in a moment of extraordinary transition in the American theater, in the theater of this country. And it is going to become nothing like what it has been. The business models, the subscription models, all the for-profit models, it's all shifting dramatically in ways that many of us who have been like in it for 10, 20, 30 years can only begin to imagine. I'm dropping a video in for folks. It's the Berkana Institute's Two Loops video, Theory of Change, their theory of change. And it is an extraordinary video to view the industry of the theater through.
Awesome. Snehal, take us home. Thank you all for coming out. This will be the final word. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say, to every educator here, you have transformative influence on these folks in your programs. I definitely would not be here if Vinnie Murphy at Emory did not see a career and a future for myself in this field. Otherwise, I was on my way to law school. So I think you have so much influence and impact. And I think you know that and recognize that, but know that also trickles down to the work. And then, social justice and great artistry are not mutually exclusive things. Right? Somewhere along the lines, also, we've created this separate but unequal system of culturally specific institutions and predominantly white institutions. And you're often sending students, telling them they have to choose a track. And I think that is something that has to be kind of abolished, in the coming years and the coming generation, because yes, that does exist. And that is because current systems are perpetuated. But there are ways of blowing that up. And then, I think there's just so much opportunity and there's just so much room for change. And so I think we're all looking forward to it.
We're all looking forward to it. You heard it here. Thank you all so much. This is phenomenal. And take this with you through the rest of the conference. Nicole, Hodges, Persley, and thank you so much for being with us. Shanta, Snehal, Maria, and Eric, Amy and Mitchell, and the conference committee for organizing. Fantastic. We'll see you all at the next event.